We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here. I'm Hollie Marquess and I'm in the history program, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Amber Nickell, also in the history program. Our student, senior history major, Sarah Keiss, and the executive director of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education, Jessica Rockhold.
This is the first event of the third annual Hayes Holocaust Remembrance and Education Month. This month intends to educate the public on the Holocaust, and this year's theme is the Holocaust in the Heartland, focusing and discussing Midwestern experiences and scholarship. Throughout the month of April, there will be several events planned to commemorate, educate, including other public lectures, a movie screening, and discussions.
Throughout to the Midwest is our mapping project, where we use oral history testimony from the Fortunoff Archives to tell the stories of Holocaust survivors who settled in the Kansas City area. It actually got its start during last year's Holocaust Remembrance Month. Forsyth Library became an access point for the Fortunoff Archives, and its director, Stephen Naran, was in town to present that and noticed a display that Sarah had created. And he was so impressed with her, and we got to talking about her as a student, but also her love of maps. We had just come back from Poland at this point last year, and one thing led to another, and we devised this idea to use these testimonies to tell these stories. So Amber is going to demonstrate this larger map, as you can see here. Each of the maps that we have created, each of the stories, the testimonies are clickable. Scrolling through here a little bit, you'll hear from 3 or 4 of them today. And this is still a work in progress. We're adding to it. We have, I think, 5 more to go to add, but we're excited to show you how we could use these maps to articulate Holocaust survival in the Midwest.
So I'm going to quickly show you the app itself and kind of how to use it. I will say that it is still a little bit laggy because we do have a copious amount of data even in here, even though it doesn't look like it's a copious amount of data. So what you're looking at right here, these are the paths and the locations of all of the survivors that we have mapped to date. And I know that it's a lot to deal with, but if we zoom in on some of these places, like say, for example, Europe, you can see how intertwined the path of these 41 survivors was. And you can see that all of them will eventually settle, build their lives, and build their homes here in the American Midwest in Kansas. Inside of the app, every single location is clickable, and when you click on it, you can pull up the experience of the survivor at that particular location. So you can see here that one of our survivors, AAP, was in Milwaukee for a while, and you can read a little bit about his experience. Every single point on this map is clickable. This is why there's so much data embedded here. And then for those of you who are interested in using this as a teaching tool, which is really what we hope this to be used for, the map itself is interactive. You can turn off and turn on all of the layers just by clicking here. So for example, if we wanted to narrow down to just one survivor's map, or maybe 2 survivors map, and look at the way that they are interacting with one another, we can do that. So it's fully interactive. And we hope to use this app as a tool for teaching alongside the more individualized story maps that we have created. And that is something that I think we're each going to walk you through at least one survivor story here in a moment. Additionally, I know that this is more of a public-facing presentation, and this is really the goal to engage the public, but some of you might be curious about the scholarly implications of a project like this. And so I do want to talk to you a little bit about that. For those that don't know me, I am a scholar of the Holocaust. I've been working in Holocaust studies for some time. And there are a couple trends in the scholarship that I can tell you about. One of those trends is dealing with the complicated geography of the Holocaust. Often when we think about it, we think about concentration camps and killing centers in Poland. This is the place that folks usually land geographically. And only recently, scholars have started thinking about other geographies of the Holocaust in the past 20 to 25 years. This includes the Holocaust in the East, so the Soviet Union, which is what I actually work on mostly, as well as survival on the margins in places like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Iran, etc. And this trend in rethinking the geography is only now starting to also make us rethink the geography of survival itself. What happens after people experience these horrific experiences and survive? Where do they go? And for the most part, when we think about this and we think about the United States, folks tend to think of coastal areas, New York, or maybe large cities, Chicago. Rarely do people think about the American Midwest, and even more rarely do they think about Kansas, which is after all our home here, right? So we really hope that this project will help scholars rethink the geography of survival and include Kansas in that much larger narrative.
So we're going to share some stories with you today, and I'm going to start with Jack Mandelbaum. So I want to just quickly show you how the website looks. So they should be pretty similar for each person. We have their story here, a picture from their when they gave their testimony, their individualized map, a quote from their testimony, and a little bit of a historical analysis. Then we have a link to their abridged testimony. So you can go to this link and hear a portion of their testimony, so you can hear them speak it themselves. But we're going to go through the guided tour of his map. Jack was born Janek Mandelbaum in Gdansk, Poland, but he was actually raised in Gdynia, where his father owned a fish cannery business. He remembers going to the beach with his mother and his siblings and having a very happy childhood. He was not religiously educated. They went to a school that was mostly with Catholic children. He calls it a lovely life. By August of 39, his father felt that they would be safer in his own hometown, Jeloshice, and they moved there. And his father was right that they were in quite a bit of danger. His father was actually arrested in September of 1939 and taken to Stutthof concentration camp. The family got one postcard from him in Stutthof and then never heard from him again. The mother moved Jack and his little brother to her hometown, Sławków, Poland, where she felt she would be more comfortable because she had family around. His sister was 15 at this point and went to stay with an aunt and an uncle. It was one less mouth for his mother to feed, but they were expecting a baby and thought that she could help. So Jack at this point is 13 years old, and he is faced with being the man of the house. He was too young to be sent on labor battalions, but you could pay someone to work for you if you didn't want to go. And so he would get labor assignments in this way and earn a little money. He started working for an electrician and got work papers. For an electrician, he was an apprentice, and they were working on a house that a Nazi was going to occupy. And this ended up saving his life because when the ghetto was rounded up, they put his entire family, his mother and his little brother at this point, and Jack all on one side, but he showed his work papers, and so he was yanked over to the other side. He never saw his mother or brother again. He was sent to Blackammer concentration camp, and he recalls it being very cold. Wooden barracks, very thin uniforms. He recalls having to urinate in a can at night and then having to use that same can to drink out of the next day. He did various labor there. He talks about witnessing beatings, and again, remember, he's just a child at this point. He also mentions that older prisoners tried to entice the younger boys to have sex with them for extra rations of bread here. He very clearly remembers the first camp he went to and the last camp he went to. He doesn't quite remember the order of the other camps because he says, well, none of us were keeping a calendar, but he does talk about in each camp that he was at, unsanitary conditions, lack of food, beatings. He also talks a lot about loneliness. He was initially pretty hopeful that he was going to survive. He's a very young man. And he notes that he thought it was harder on the adults. They had more worries, but he was pretty hopeful. He said, we could see a person who was going to die maybe a week before he died. You could see in his eyes this frozen look that he had. He had given up. We never felt sorry for a prisoner who died in camp because we felt he's released from this horrible life and the misery that he no longer had to suffer. He does make a friend, Moniak Chesla, in this camp, and he said that was really crucial to his survival, having someone to look out for him and someone he could look out for. They both, around 1944, were sent to Bad Warmbrum concentration camp, and they did a variety of labor there, including at one point they were tasked with loading corpses onto a truck and then unloading them because this particular camp did not have a crematoria, so they were taken to another location. And while he's throwing these corpses off, he kept thinking, well, who's gonna throw my body off when it's my turn? So he starts to feel like he may not survive. He got a stroke of luck, though. They got reassigned to a kitchen duty, and it was easier to steal food in that context. By 45, he was sent to Dornau concentration camp, and this was primarily occupied by Hungarian Jews, and he doesn't speak Hungarian. He also doesn't speak Yiddish because he was not, he did not grow up with that religious education. So he felt very depressed and very lonely because he couldn't even talk to people who were in the camp other than Moniak. He remembers sitting on steps and thinking that there were so many lice on him that the lice could carry him down the steps because they were so prevalent. But one day he and Moniak noticed that the guards were gone, and so they left. They happened to find a supply wagon that still had a horse attached to it, so they get on this wagon. They have no idea where they're going. They ended up at the nearby Langenbielau camp and ended up liberating that camp, which he said, we became the liberators of this camp. He brought the news of liberation. They beat the Russians there. They spent some time living in houses that the Germans had abandoned. For a while, he said that they would use that house until all the dishes were dirty, and then they would just move on to another house. He tries to go back to Poland in 1946 several times to find news of his family, and there never was any. But eventually he moves to Zelsheim, displaced persons camp, which was in the American zone. And he hears there that he can get a visa. He thought that was going to be impossible because his whole family's dead. He has no one to sponsor him. But he hears he can get a visa. And he also heard that his uncle Sigmund was at the Landsberg displaced persons camp. So he goes there, gets his uncle, and they are going to immigrate together. He also happened to run into his mother's sister. So of their 90-person family, just the 3 of them survived. They come to New York in 1946 and again felt really lonely. They came on a troop ship. So there were a lot of people holding signs, you know, welcome home, Bill. He realized no one was waiting for him, and no one was going to be waiting for him because his entire family had perished. The Jewish Joint, which is the organization that would help with resettlement, asked where he wanted to go. And he said, a place not too big, not too small. And they said Kansas City. And he's asked, well, why do you suggest that? And they said, well, we sent some people there in the 30s and we never heard from them again. So we assume it was good. So Kansas City is where they set up shop. Again, he talks about being lonely because of language, but he spent his evenings in classes to learn English. He worked at Rose Mercantile until 56 when he was able to buy the business. And he focused on raising his kids. He calls it a time for his stomach, where he asked to put food on the table and give his kids the education that he could not get. In 1990, he took a trip with his friend Isaac Federman, who is also on this list. You can check out his story. His story is wild. He took a trip to Stutthof concentration camp museum to try to find out what happened to his family. He was worried that he could not see their faces anymore, and he was trying to find a picture. He found out that they left for this trip September 14th, 1990, and he found out that his father had been arrested September 14th, 1939. So exactly 51 years to the day. He did die there in 1944, and he also found out on this trip that his mother and both of his siblings were murdered in the gas chamber. In 1993, Jack and Isaac, so that's Jack here, and this is Isaac Federman, founded the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. He calls this the time for his soul. He noticed that other atrocities were happening, and he didn't want people to stand by as a spectator. So he really felt it was so important to educate the Kansas City community about what had happened. He died August 6th, 2023. This is him with his grandchildren. We have been finding documents as well, and I'm not going to take you through this entire document, but this is his displaced persons registration record. We took a trip to DC to get these records. So for each of our people, we're uploading these documents. They verify what they've said in their stories and sometimes add to those missing pieces.
So I will be sharing the story of Hannah Sander. I listened to both Hannah and her husband Abe's testimonies, and both of them really stuck out to me. So Hannah was born in Dąbrowa Górnicka, Poland in 1924. She recalls having a really good childhood, and her parents raised their 3 children to all be proud Jews. She attended grade school in her hometown, and then after she was done with grade school, she moved to Snowsnowfic for a short period of time. She had to return home when the German invasion began, and she could not complete her schooling there. So when she returned to her hometown, she recalls a story in which her uncle ran from his nearby town, which is only a couple miles away, to warn them that the German soldiers were coming into their town. Hannah found it hard to believe that anything would happen to her family, and she couldn't really believe that this was happening. Her father worked for a Jewish federation and was an important man in the town, so she couldn't really think that anything would happen to him or to her family. Later, her family was ordered to meet at a school in Snowsnowfic. The soldiers told them that either Hannah or her sister had to leave for work. Hannah volunteered because she was the oldest and she was separated from her family at this point. They also asked her father which child he wanted to go to work, and he said that he couldn't possibly make that decision, so she volunteered for it. She was taken by train to Grunberg and Schliessen, a subcamp of the Gross-Relsen camp system. Since Hannah was here early in the war, she was still able to receive mail when she was first here. Conditions began to gradually worsen and food became more scarce. They also stopped receiving mail. Girls in the camp would do anything in order to get food, including eating out of the trash. She also recalls seeing a mother and a daughter fighting for food. The camp was riddled with bed bugs, but Hannah did what she could to stay clean, and because of this, the other girls deemed her as the clean girl. At the end, she was here for several years, until the end of 1944, when she was put on a death march. Her and the other prisoners slept in barns at night, and at one point, Hannah attempted to hide from the guards in a pile of hay in one of the barns. She was caught and she was beaten for attempting to hide, and she was too scared to ever attempt this again. Hannah and the other prisoners walked over 700 miles with little food and no showers for 7 weeks. They walked all the way to Hanover, Germany, where they boarded a train to Bergen-Belsen. Once she arrived at Bergen-Belsen, the conditions here were awful. The guards were very violent against the prisoners, and Hannah had held on to the letters she received in her first camp. But when they were found by one of the officers, she received 25 lashes for this. It's actually kind of interesting because many of the documents that she had provided to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum were actually from these letters that she was able to keep hidden throughout this time. The guards at the concentration camp were very brutal, and their hygiene there was even worse than the previous camp. They were not given adequate clothing or food, and they were quite susceptible to illness. She explains a time in which she became ill and stayed in a sort of infirmary. Of the 7 girls there, 4 of them had already passed away, but the 3 girls who were alive did not say anything because they needed their food. Reflecting on this in her interview, Hannah states that, quote, "We were selfish, we were hungry, we were not human at all." Hannah was here during liberation, but she does not remember any of liberation because she was still in the infirmary with typhus. Once she had recovered a bit, she actually stayed in Bergen-Belsen for a little bit of time until her cousin Abe discovered where she was. Hearing that he had a relative who was alive, he rode his bike from Buchenwald concentration camp to Bergen-Belsen to find her. Hannah, Abe, and another cousin, who Hannah had already been in a camp with, hitchhiked their way back to Buchenwald. And as you can see how far of a distance that was, he biked to find her. After this, Hannah made her way back to her hometown. Her cousin Abe was from the nearby town that was only a couple miles away. So they both returned to just see who else was alive. They only found one other cousin who was alive. Of her over 200 extended family members, only 3 or 4 of her cousins had survived, and none of her immediate family did. When she returned, the residents of her hometown did not treat her kindly, and she did not feel comfortable here anymore. She recalls a story in which she returned home and a teacher from her school had asked her about her weight because she was still bloated from the typhus. She just did not feel comfortable in her hometown anymore. While they were still staying here, Hannah and her cousin Abe traveled to Lodz, where they got married, and soon after, they decided that they needed to leave Poland. They stayed at a displaced persons camp for several years, and this is where they had their first child. In 1949, Hannah, Abe, and their son arrived in Kansas City. Abe's brother, Sam, who is also in these maps as well, had moved to Kansas City, and they kind of moved there together. Hannah loved Kansas City a lot, and she made many friends. For a short time, Hannah and Abe attempted to move to Milwaukee because he had gotten a job there, but she was very depressed, she said, and she just wanted to be back in Kansas City. So after a short time, they moved back to Kansas City. She explains how her and Abe worked for everything that they had, and in both of their testimonies, this is really a point of pride for both of them. They said that they accepted like one government aid check or something at the beginning, and then they kind of refused to accept any other help. They just worked very hard, and they really appreciated that they had the opportunity to do this in America. She states that she is very grateful for moving to this country. So while I was listening to Hannah's testimony, there were kind of 2 specific things that stuck out to me. So one of the stories that she explains was that while she was staying in one of the displaced persons camps, she was in the kitchen peeling potatoes, and someone said that her sister was waiting outside for her. When she went outside, she never found her sister. And then later, when Hannah and Abe went to Lodz to get married, they found a list of survivors, and she swore that she saw her sister's name, which was Sonia. And she said that she was never able to find her again or to confirm if this was actually her sister. So while we were in Washington, D.C., and we had access to a lot of these archives, we actually attempted to find any information about her sister to see if this was actually her, and if she had survived. Unfortunately, we could not find anything corroborating that she did survive. We found a cousin who actually had the same name, which possibly might have been the name that was written down. So that was kind of unfortunate, but this experience really showed me a lot about just kind of the stories that have been lost. And for each of these maps that we have, you know, they all had extended family members and friends that did not survive the Holocaust. And I think that really resonated with me and was very interesting. And something else that stuck out to me was the story of Hannah and Abe and how they kind of came together and really were just able to find each other again and find comfort in each other. And so one of the features of our map, as we were kind of mentioning earlier, is that you can click on and off certain maps, certain people. So we were actually able to kind of show how their paths intertwine and then how they come together at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, and then where they continue together for the rest of the time. So that's kind of an interesting feature of this, and we can also do that with their other family members, like Abe's brother and other things like that.
So I am actually going to share the story of one of the more well-known of the survivors from Kansas City. And that is Sonia Warshawski, or many might know her as Big Sonia, because there's actually a documentary about her. And if you haven't seen the documentary yet, we are showing it at the Hayes Public Library on April 16th at 6 p.m. So you can always come see the documentary as well. So Sonia Warshawski was actually also born in Poland, and she describes the town that she grew up in as being overwhelmingly Jewish, a majority Jewish, actually. And for this reason, she grew up relatively proud of her Jewishness, as well as connected to Jewish movements that were very popular in the interwar period, including ideas like Zionism. In fact, she belonged to a young Zionist movement, as did some of her other family members. Her father was, relatively well off, though not wealthy by any means. So she doesn't really necessarily have anything negative to say about her childhood. So this is relatively common among survivors because often childhood is overshadowed by the atrocities that they experienced during the Holocaust. She was rather young when the war broke out. She was about 12 and a half years old. And this was old enough to work, but certainly if any of you can remember being 12, right, it's a very difficult age to deal with what happened. For a brief moment, the town that she was from was occupied by the Nazis in 1939, and then the Soviets occupied it, and then the Nazis occupied it again. And this happened a lot in the borderlands. But as a result of this, quite a few of the Jews from her town actually were evacuated or deported by the Soviets eastward. And they survived the Holocaust as a result of this, because of this Soviet deportation. However, Sonia's family did not want to go with the Soviets. They did not trust them, probably for good reason, right? But still, they didn't quite know what was going on, so they chose to stay behind. And after the Soviets evacuated and made space for the Nazis to come back in, she recalls the Wehrmacht arriving, which is the official military. And then after that, the SS, which will be a paramilitary organization that oversees and executes a majority of the Holocaust. Like many large shtetls or towns in Poland, the Nazi administration began the process of ghettoizing the population. That is, moving them into a much smaller concentrated area. In some instances, this included walled-in ghettos, and a lot of people think of places like Krakow or Warszawa when they think of these places. But the ghetto that she was placed in and her family was placed in is actually what's called an open ghetto. So there's no wall around it, but everyone has to have a pass to get in and a pass to get out. And this openness actually created a route for her brother to survive, at least temporarily. Her brother will, in the long run, be executed by Nazis, but he does survive temporarily roundups because of this. They start the process of deporting the Jewish population from the ghetto. A majority of the Jews from this town will go to a killing center called Treblinka. For those that don't know much about Treblinka, there are less than 200 survivors. So this is an absolute killing center in which almost everyone is murdered immediately. And the first roundup is extremely chaotic. People are screaming in the streets. The Jews are forced to run. She just remembers watching this, and it's a very traumatic experience for her. But over time, she recalls that the roundups became more orderly. And by the time that her family was rounded up, it was a very orderly process. When her family was finally caught hiding in the ghetto and rounded up, it was her sister, her father, and her mother. Her brother was actually working outside of the ghetto at the time. And when the Nazi administration was not paying attention, her father pushed her little sister into kind of an alley, and her sister survived in hiding. Her sister will actually be the only other family member from her immediate family who will survive. And her father managed to break away and run off during the process of deportation. So she was deported with her mother, and she spent her early time in the concentration camp system with her mother. They were at Majdanek concentration camp, which is both a killing center and a concentration camp. So during the first period, they were mostly involved in forced labor. However, they were gradually deporting, the Nazis were gradually deporting the population from Majdanek, and they began gassing people at Majdanek. And one day there was a selection, and Sonia was sent to one side and her mother was sent to the other. They immediately knew what this meant. They knew what was coming. And she watched from the barracks as her mother was marched to her death. And she recalls this moment as really kind of framing the rest of her life, right? This moment of watching her mother being marched to her death. Shortly thereafter, she was sent to Auschwitz, but in her memories, she calls it Birkenau Auschwitz. And so this is what I've chosen to use here. At Birkenau and Auschwitz, she was mostly in forced labor. At one point, she was forced to work on the farms at Auschwitz, and a lot of folks are like, what, farms at Auschwitz? But yes, they did have farms at Auschwitz. And in many instances, she could hear and see people arriving at Auschwitz being forced to their death. She could see the crematorium running almost 24 hours a day. And then she was forced to fertilize the fields with the ashes of the people who were murdered. And as you can imagine, something like this has a tremendous psychological impact on a human being. And this is something you see very clearly in Sonia's adult life. She will survive several selections at Auschwitz because she's clever. She does things like hide in piles of clothes. She will sneak around the side of a building. She is actively resisting in all of the ways that she can. And do know that lots of people actively resisted in all the ways that they could, and they still died. So there's also an element of luck here. When the Nazis found out that the Red Army was quickly closing in on Auschwitz, they began the process of creating what they called death marches. The people that could walk were forcibly marched for miles and miles and days with very little food. And those who could not keep up were shot on the spot. And so Sonia survived a death march to Dachau. And when they got to Dachau, the group was split in half. Half of that group went to Bergen-Belsen, which is where Sonia spent the remainder of the war. Death didn't stop there just because there's not a gas chamber at Bergen-Belsen. People dropped dead of disease and starvation. She called this dying like flies. And she actually sustained the largest injury that she sustained during the entirety of the war physically, because she had emotional injuries there. On the day of liberation, she was shot by a stray bullet in her chest. So she thought that she might die on the day of liberation. But she actually survived in an unknown camp hospital that was run by the English afterwards. She then began the process of rebuilding her life in the Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp. Anything stand out to you guys about Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp and concentration camp? A lot of survivors were forced to rebuild their lives in the very places that had been the sites of their oppression. And while Bergen-Belsen was actually rebuilt nearby, the name was kept the same. Like many of the other survivors, she chose to go look for her family members. She tried to go find her family members. And she did eventually find her sister and learned about her sister's experience during the war, which I would be happy to talk about during Q&A, but I want to make sure that we can get through everything here. She will go to Warsaw for her sister to get married, and then she will return to the Bergen-Belsen displaced person camp to start thinking about how to leave Poland, to leave Germany. And she will spend some time in the American zone because she finds that a lot of people have a better chance of immigrating if they move to the American zone of occupation. And she will meet her husband in the concentration camp itself. His name is John. And this is really important because she will open a seamstress shop in Kansas City that is named for John. So this will become important. Like many of our survivors, they will stop in New York en route to Kansas. And she will go to Kansas City, Overland Park, where she will build a life with a very large and successful family. And for those of you that don't know, this is one of the biggest acts of resistance to Nazi oppression right here, right? Surviving and building a family. And this is something that she did.
So one of the things that we were really interested in is geography, right? As you can see from the map, we have South Africa, Kazakhstan, we have so many different places on these maps, but we're really interested in why these people chose Kansas City, and we found that it was really varied. You heard that Jack Mandelbaum was just told, you know, it's good because we left those people there and we never heard from them again, so it must be good. Isaac Federman had a similar experience. They said, you're going to Kansas City, and he said, well, where is that? And they said, it's a nice place, you'll like it. So some of them are moving for family members. Sonia had a family member that was already there. The Gudovitzes had an uncle that was already there, and so they're being pulled by family connections. Others, it's jobs, and so it's completely varied. Beyond geography, we learned so much about using oral history testimony for each one of these people. Between 1 and 3 hours of testimony that we're listening to, we're poring over documents, we're trying to trace every loose end that we can. We found that they're willing to discuss their most painful experiences in order to educate the public, and they're willing to talk about things that aren't as talked about in the traditional narratives, things like menstruation, abortion, sexual assault, sex between men. So the survivors that we had in our project were very brave, very honest, and are just a wealth of information.
As a scholar who's like generally interested in geography and history, this project was a perfect fit for me, and I was delighted when we started it. One of the things, though, that I'm more new in using is oral history. I've collected oral histories in Ukraine. I have worked with oral histories tangentially as kind of a way to nuance my narratives, but actually working with them as the sole source base is something rather new for me. And one of the things that really surprised me when working with them is the extreme amount of geographic and temporal discontinuity in the way that survivors tell their stories. So in the ways that we just told these stories, it sounds like they might have said, I went here, and then I went here, and then I went here. But in reality, when they tell their stories, they often hop back and forth between space and time, leaving it to us as the researchers and the mappers to make sense of that for you. In many ways, this is great for educating about the Holocaust, but sometimes projects like the ones that we've just shown you actually flatten experience, right? We've made it seem much cleaner and more coherent than it actually was in practice. And this is something that we have been thinking about and talking about as a group. We do know that we will have several publications that come out of this project, and one of them might have to do with the way that things are remembered, the way that stories are told, and then the way that they are retold as we are retelling them using this mapping project.
Something else that this mapping project can show is just the true kind of complexity of the systems of detention that were in place. This is something that's not always understood, and it might be hard to understand, but maps such as ours can help with this. So I wanted to show some kind of examples from the USHMM website, just to provide some background. So the this map shows the major Nazi camps in Europe. And so as you can see, they're distributed throughout the continent. There are a lot of them. And then looking closer, this is the camps in the Greater Germany territory. You can see just how many camps there are in this smaller area and just how concentrated they are. And then each of these maps also had their own, these camps had their own countless sub-camps and factories and other sites that these survivors and these people went through. The geographic complexity of this can also show kind of the wide range of experiences that are seen throughout all of our maps. And our maps can kind of help show all of this together. In almost every testimony, a different camp is mentioned. Despite the fact that this is still kind of a smaller sample size of about 40 survivors, they all went to unique locations and had their own unique experiences. Our maps themselves can show a substantial amount of different subcamps, factories, and ghettos, just kind of showing the wide variety of things that people went through during this. And this can be very beneficial in helping individuals understand more about the complexity of these camp systems. As well as kind of the legacy of the Holocaust after the war, seeing the geographic spread of these survivors after the war and where they ended up, where they built their families. It shows how kind of the legacy of the Holocaust is all around the world. It has left an impact in all of these communities and all of these families, and mapping it in this way is kind of a way to show just how, these survivors moved and made their own experiences elsewhere.
Yeah, and again, for each one of these people that we've mapped, there are countless family members whose maps would end in a ravine or in a ghetto or in a camp. And so that's something we're cognizant of. We also have 4 or 5 Americans from the Kansas City area who came over as liberators. We want to map as a sister map for this. But before we get to the Q&A, Jessica, could you talk about its usefulness to you?
Sure. So as they mentioned, I'm the director of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. So our first project, when Jack and Isaac founded our center almost 1 year ago now, was to collect these testimonies. And at the time, the primary kind of impetus was preservation. We have to collect them. We have to make sure that they're preserved. One thing that's been critical to our center is ensuring that they don't just sit on a shelf, right? Sometimes an archive has a little bit of a reputation of this repository, but it doesn't do anybody any good unless they can access it and interact with it. And so over the years, we've had several projects. We even just digitizing these testimonies was a major undertaking. We teach with them extensively. So when, we got the call from Dr. Nickell saying, what do you think about this project? Can we partner? First of all, you had me at the word maps because I'm a geography nut. But the concept of being able, you used the word that you're concerned that it might flatten it. I am not as concerned about that because I think this makes it live in a really vibrant way. One of the things that we see with survivor testimonies, 2 things I'll highlight. For instance, Sonia, right? Most people get in their head she was in Auschwitz, and she was. And that is the kind of central part of her story. But if that's all you remember, you've lost all of that other context that happened to her. Or somebody like Hannah, or you mentioned Isaac and what a wild story it is. If I remember right, it's 15 or 17 different deportation experiences he has. 19. So once they are in that kind of pattern of movement, we lose them, right? And partly because of what Dr. Nickell mentioned, that they aren't using the camp name. They're telling you what the company was, the factory they were working at, right? So this is a way to make very concrete for our learners how these people individually experience the event. One of the things that we talk about a lot is we get bogged down in the number 6 million. And we think about, at that point, we're not even thinking about the survivors, right? We're thinking about the people who were murdered, but we get bogged down in that number and we think about it as this crime, like a singular thing that happened to 6 million people. I always try to flip that. It's a crime that happened individually to all of these millions of people, and each of their experience of it is individual. And so that's what a project like this does. Whether we're bringing it to the public or taking it into a classroom, it helps people take something that's too big for the imagination and put it in a really concrete place, especially for American learners who have really bad European geography. The history department laughs, they know. But here's one that you might not have thought of. And one of the reasons I am most excited about this project is for the survivors' families. they don't know where their parents were sometimes, right? They have these anecdotes that they've heard. Their parent has told them a story, but they don't have a real understanding of where that was. Did it come before or after she was in Auschwitz, right? Where is that camp from the hometown? Sarah mentioned how far it was that they biked that distance. Being able to see something this concrete makes all of that so real. And I think that aside from our kind of general learners, students and just the public, this is going to be a wonderful tool for the families. And when I think about what something like this will mean to the survivors who are still with us and would mean to those that aren't, there was always worry. What happens when I'm not there to tell the story? And each time we participate in a project like this and personalize this in such a specific and meaningful way, it helps that story live, not just for the survivor, but for the people in their family who didn't, that they're talking about.
What questions do you have for us? And Brian, if you have any online, you can certainly hop into. Go ahead.
What gravitated you to be involved in this in Kansas City?
So I am actually from Russell, just,
Oh, really?
30 minutes down the road.
Wow.
Yes, I'm a local girl. I've come home today. I was probably inappropriately introduced to this as a fourth grader. Probably a little too young to have been taught something about the Holocaust. But from that point, maybe 9 or 10 years old, fourth grader, I was interested in it. And I had the opportunity, this is what my graduate work was in. I went and I did a research assistantship with the senior historian at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So it's just something I've always been interested in. I had specific opportunities that set me on a career path. But at the end of the day, one of the reasons that I am here is because of these people on this screen, right? People that are in this field now are going to be the last ones who knew the survivors. I've been at the center for 21 years. So most of our survivors I actually knew. And so it has become not just an academic pursuit, but something very personal, because once you know them, you'll never forget them.
I'll yield to the students. I have 2 more questions.
Do we have any from online?
We do. An individual asks, when utilizing this map and filtering by family members and other connections, is there a way to view these pathways and stories simultaneously, or do you have to just look at them individually?
So the actual story maps are all individual. However, we have talked about doing a sister map that just has family groups or partners. We have several married people, so you can interact by turning off, as you saw Amber do, and put maybe Isaac and Ann Fetterman and see where they cross paths. But their individual stories are separate.
Although they could, I mean, you could hypothetically run 2 instances of the story maps. So if you just open the website twice and then split it into 2 screens, you could do that if you want. But it is actually, it is a lot of data. So I don't know if anybody watched it load here for a minute, but like for us to get this map to load, it takes 3 minutes, and this is a beast of a machine. Thank you, Innovation Grant. But this is a beast of a machine. So unlike your normal computer, this would probably have taken 15 to 20 minutes to load with the insets that we have here, which is why we didn't go with this as our main app format, but I wanted to show you.
Looking at those married couples, I think is really interesting. So Abe and Bertha Goodovitz, for example, they reunite, they were cousins, they reunite after the war, and they want to go look for their respective brothers. She has a brother that's alive, and he has 2 that are alive. But she said, I'm not traveling around with you if we're not married. So we have to go get married. And they go get married. But he doesn't bring that up in his testimony. So she's going to have an extra stop on her story that says the town that they traveled to get married. It's not on his story. I know that they went there, but it was not brought up in his story, so it's not matched. So we're staying as close as possible to their oral history testimony. So kind of comparing who brings up what in those family pairs is really interesting. Other questions? Go ahead.
There's a lady that, I believe she's from McPherson, Jansen Schindler. Does that ring a bell?
There is a survivor in that area. I
Yeah.
don't know the person though.
She did a presentation at the Hayes Public Library one time, and one of her daughters is actually from Ellis, Susan Biddle. And, it was a pleasure to meet her, and I've got her book, so I think the Hayes Library may have that book. If not, I'll try to see if I have it, bring it tonight. But, thank you so much for all your work on this thing. This is fascinating. One other question, are any of you actually Jewish?
I'm not.
Nope.
I've met a local person by chance, and I'm hoping his son will come to the library tonight, and he fascinating. He was in the service in the Army, and so I'll leave it alone. I won't get into too much detail, but I've invited, just fascinated with this subject, so I hope to make every one of these things fantastic. I applaud you all for this.
Any other questions, Chris?
Yeah. I'm just curious, do you think the patterns of relocation a little bit into the Midwest is kind of different from those who went to other regions of the United States? Do you think that their experiences are similar or different in any way?
I mean, I think every individual's experience is different. Even like the groups that came to, the individuals that came to Kansas City, every single one of them had a different experience in Kansas City or around Kansas City. Some people were delighted and loved the life that they built. I have a couple who spent much of their adult life depressed and feeling like they were outside. And so each person, there's a variation in experience, and that is going to go across the board regardless of the geography that you're talking about. But there are some differences in kind of like job trajectories, I think that are kind of interesting that are starting to stand out. And this, again, this is very tentative. We've only got 40 some cases that we are dealing with here. So to make some sort of wide sweeping claim would probably be not accurate at this time. But a lot of folks who are going to the East Coast are landing more in kind of a corporate experience or factory experience. Quite a few of the individual survivors that I've dealt with and that they've dealt with build their own businesses. And a lot of them are actually in similar types of fields as what their families were in Poland, for example. So like tailoring is very, very heavy. There's quite a few tailors in our situation. There's candy stores, there's, so like following those trajectories. I'm wondering if maybe the opportunity, the economic opportunity in the Midwest is slightly higher than the economic opportunity might have been in New York. But again, that's just kind of
But with Kansas City, you have to think about in New York, they would have huge swaths of Jewish populations. In Kansas City, for the Mandlers, for example, they go to Chillicothe. Her husband was an ENT and he got a job in Chillicothe, and they had to drive 150 miles every Sunday for their daughter to get a Jewish education. So they're not going to have the same kind of networking with this much smaller population. Did you look your hand? Did you have a question? Sorry, go
I
ahead.
think I could add maybe 2 anecdotes about the Kansas City community. When you mentioned the tailors, maybe not as prevalently known here as it is there, but Kansas City had a garment industry. So we drew a lot of tailors because of that industry in a very specific way. The other is you mentioned the size of the Jewish community. There is a smaller level, a smaller community of highly observant Jews in Kansas City than there would be in New York or Chicago, right? So their opportunity for choosing how to participate in their Jewish life is different in Kansas City than it would have been in one of those larger Jewish population centers.
Genealogy, I have 16 out there, 16 first. But my age. And then I tried to get the old guys. And so then so that I could get, and and then they gave me it's up to, how
Perspective and, just point out tonight, or this, we have a group that meets in the Kansas room every Thursday at 10 o'clock. We have various subjects that come up. We had probably 10 of them there this morning. And these handouts were given to our group at the Kansas room, the Hayes Public Library. Jeremy Gill is the director of that part. So everybody has gotten one of these. And so we hope to see more of our Kansas room people there. At any one time, we have a dozen or 13 people there one morning. All subjects were brought up. This was brought up and shared with everybody there. So we hope we have a good crowd for you tonight. You're
Yeah.
all welcome to come.
Everybody got bookmarks that has the remaining events, including tonight. Jessica is doing Americans in the Holocaust tonight at 6 p.m. at Hayes Public Library.
I think we had an online.
We have quite a few coming in. Okay, so let me combine a few. Several students ask, one, has this project gotten bigger than originally anticipated? Okay.
Yes.
And then relatedly, one of you students is asking if you begin to look at or thinking about looking at any other survivors who immigrated to Kansas and settled outside the Kansas City area, and if there are any kind of indications of motivations, if they were thinking about engaging in agriculture in any way, or if that was.
We've started with the Fortunoff collection. There were, as I mentioned, some liberators that we're going to do on a separate map. We decided to stay with the survivors first. And so beyond this collection, once we get this one done, we are looking to expand to Nebraska, Colorado, the rest of Kansas, Missouri, and really highlight this Midwest.
Okay.
And we also have another set that was collected by the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education at various times that is posted on their website that we're going to start trying to integrate. But this project took a lot more time than it looks like it takes. I think we were all sitting around the dinner table and we're like, this is going to be easy. I work with maps all the time. Not a big deal. I'll just, we'll listen to a couple oral histories. We'll put some data in some Excel. It's easy peasy, right? I think each one of the individual maps, and I'm probably understating here, between listening and constructing a map takes about 10 to 15 hours. So this 40, you guys can do the math, right? So we know that in order to continue this project and to grow this project in the ways that we're starting to envision, it's going to require a significant amount of external funding. So we've already started the process of putting together NEH grants and an NEH kind of committee or advisory committee. And we'll be looking into things like that. But this is big, and it will require us to actually draw some lines around things. We have to control our data as opposed to getting too crazy. In terms of agriculture, there is this kind of misnomer that Jews don't do agriculture in the scholarship. There's actually a pretty large Jewish farming community in Kansas. And I do think that there are some survivors there, and I would love to find the information. Unfortunately, a lot of that is not in this collection, but we could look at places like the USC Shoah testimonies. We could look at other Fortunoff testimonies now that we are an access site. And of course, if any students that are listening in person or online want to do similar projects, there are so many oral histories to map that we would love for armies of people to take up this kind of work, right?
I just want to give my compliments to you for doing this work, because digital humanities research at universities desperately needed. I think
We've got a plan for that.
We do have a plan for
the
that.
power of it.
Yeah.
So I just want to say thank you.
Any questions on that?
We have a few more. Chelsea's asking if Hannah and her husband were first cousins.
Do you
Is that
remember? I think there were second cousins.
second?
Were they first cousins?
She just said cousins. I think they were first cousins.
Is European not surprising.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Also, there's the community is severely diminished.
Of course.
And this is not I would marry my cousin in this circumstance too.
And relatedly, in the survivor testimonies you looked at, did you find any kind of overlapping pathways between those survivors? Were they in the same displaced persons camps at the same time?
We found a lot of that.
Yeah.
Of course, the ones that we know that got married and were continuing on, but there are several that were in the same VP camps at the same time, but they may not ever have talked about each other. So we don't know if they ever crossed black paths, but if you fiddle with these maps enough, you can see that there are a number of people that cross paths in various camps, but also in the DP camps.
I think it's also important to remember that there are people who aren't related that become family and so choose to travel together, right? So we have couples, I'm thinking particularly in the Italian displaced persons camps, where that's their new family. They met each other, they're close, and they came to Kansas City together. I'm sure that's true of every city.
We actually, at the Holocaust Museum, found some pictures of a couple survivors in an Italian DP camp together.
We grabbed all of those, even though they're not in this set, they're in the next set, but we grabbed all the documentation, so we're ready to go. We're well prepared for the second set.
I'm just curious, in the testimonies you reviewed, did you ever come across any conveyance that the survivors mentioned being in DP camps alongside suspected or known perpetrators or collaborators?
Mine didn't mention that.
Didn't mention.
I didn't catch any mentions of it. A lot of the survivors were at Momsburg or at Bergen-Belsen that I listened to, and I know that Bergen-Belsen was exclusively Jewish. It was one of the very few exclusively Jewish DP camps. So I don't know the level of exposure to, like, so it's not the same with like Ukrainian perpetrators or, but I have no doubt that some of them likely did encounter that. It might have just been something that was less, people select what they're going to tell in their 2 hours and 3 hours. It might have just stopped.
One in the back.
Can you talk a little bit about your trip to DC and how many days were you there? What was that experience like?
Sarah, do you want to go with that one?
Yes. Limited time frame, though, you only there for the events.
Yeah, so we went to Washington DC. I think the total was like about a week. Yeah, we were there for about a week. So we kind of sectioned off some of the days to go to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Chappelle Center, where we were actually, so beforehand, we requested the documents and stuff, and then they bring them for us to look at. But while we were also there, we looked at the International Tracing Service archives, which are online, and they're very complex. That is where most of our additional documents, like at the end, are from. And so that part was definitely a lot more complicated to research. And
Yeah, so we found documents like these that I'm showing, displaced persons records. We're in the process of processing them because much of it is in German and it's not a language that I personally speak. So we're working through it, trying to put some context here in what is this document saying? How does this correspond with their story? But we really feel like these documents that we collected in DC can really make this an excellent teaching tool because you can't access them without having gone to DC to sit and do this research. So these are not something that you could just pull up on the internet on your own. So these can really enhance, I think, for the family members. Most of them probably have not seen these, even if they know the story, they probably have not seen these documents. So very, very valuable research that we found here.
Also, we did find some like kind of neat sources in DC, I think, or I would call them neat. Sometimes people will donate like an individual collection or something like that. So I know I saw Sarah scanning like an entire art book.
yes, one of them, he's in the secondary set of testimonies, but he had made like countless, there had to have been like 50 caricatures of political leaders just from around the world and from like throughout history. And he also made little just kind of like comic books. So I spent a long time kind of scanning all of those. Yeah,
I did an entire book.
I had a lot of books there. But yeah, there are a lot of very interesting documents like that. And even we saw like kind of, they donated their like original passports. And it was just stuff I had never really worked with before. So that was a really interesting kind of experience. And then to be able to scan that to put in our project was really nice.
She also got to meet with leading scholars from the USHMM, not only in Holocaust scholarship, but in the digital humanities. So she got a lot of networking connections, and it was a very fruitful trip.
Thanks to the undergraduate research experience, Brian. You all should apply for it.
Well, we really thank you all for taking time out of your afternoon to come and see our project, and I encourage you all to attend tonight at Hayes Public Library, 6 p.m. to hear Americans and the Holocaust. Nailed it, Sarah. I know. So good. It is. You recorded this, right?
Yes, I recorded.
Hopefully it like stuck around. Thank you for moderating questions last
There
minute.
was a few that came in really late.